This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Robert, Kathryn, and I are talking about the relationship between stakes and agency today. So, pretty cool stuff here. Plot and character, the marriage between them. Kathryn, start us off here.
Yes, these are very nerdy terms, Kathryn. What does that all mean?
Nerdy.
Stakes and agency.
Oh, man. Stakes and agency. Okay, well this
bring us back to Earth.
Back to Earth. So you're talking about like the stakes of your plot. So or the stakes for your character, I suppose I should say. Like what is driving them, what is at stake for them as a character, right?
Yeah, so should I do a little definition? Back up and define stuff a little bit? Okay.
Yeah. And because I don't know what you want me to say here. This was a mashup.
A mashup. Okay.
Mashup.
So stakes and tension. Stakes are what rises throughout the story as the plot moves toward the climax. And tension is what the reader feels in response to those stakes rising. So they go together. But when we talk about stakes, we're talking about the events of the plot with increasing dramatic tension or comedic tension, either way, right? Rising toward that climax. So basically, things are getting harder for your character as we move toward the big bang at the top of the book. Now, agency is the character's drive, the character's free will to act and react throughout the story. So things are not just happening to the character is not being buffeted by the current. As stuff happens to and around him, the character confronts situations, makes choices, acts on them, faces consequences, reacts to what is done to him. And so we need to marry stakes and agency.
Yes. No, I think that my question here was like, in terms of when the stakes get so high, is your character really are they really capable of making the choice to enter into those stakes, or are you kind of pushing them into it because they're so high that no rational, reasonable person would actually make that choice to like jump in, let's do this?
Oh no, they must. They must have agency, and they must make that choice to go forward, which is one of the great fun aspects of writing a novel, doing long form and getting up to that point. So if you get to the point of no return at the end of Act 2, the thing that precipitates the climax, it's your character's last chance to walk away from the climax and choose a different path, right? Mm-hmm. If you get there and your character walks through that door into the climax, but your reader doesn't believe in the choice, the reader's going, nah, I would have walked away. You're stupid for for going into that battle. Then you have failed in your character's motivation. So you need to set up the complicating factors around that choice in such a way that the stakes are incredibly high, but any reasonable person would make the same choice. So going into the climax, has to be for the greater good of the story. So if the choice is leave your family in order to battle a serial killer, well, battling that serial killer has to be such a personal imperative, not just an imperative for the FBI or for, society as a whole, but personal to your protagonist, that we can all stand with her behind the choice of leaving the family.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So that's going to be all of Act 2 is building that up to that choice, that agency.
It's interesting that in talking about agency as well, that what you're saying, Kathryn, is it believable that that any normal person would run away from what they're presented with, but as a character, we've got to put them into that situation because it's going to force the climax. And so if you're talking about that idea of free will and deciding to act, that also has to line up with who we've made the character be. It can't just suddenly come out of nowhere. Or if it does, you've got to back them into a corner such that it becomes their only choice. There is nothing else they can do.
It's the damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Right. Or as Sean Coyne says, I think best bad choice. It's one or the other. It's got to happen. And then some genres, I think, lend themselves much more to plot consequences as opposed to internal psychological or emotional consequences. So it depends what type of book you're writing as well. And so a straight action story might be just life or death for the protagonist and those close, but a psychological one could be loss of love or abandonment issues or those sort of things. But I think, as Alida says, we're always talking about those stakes first being personal, and this is where I had a bit of a revelation just the other day, where it was just the other day. The first 3 books I wrote in middle grade, I kept struggling with increasing this. I wasn't in middle grade, though. Middle grade books. That's probably
that's a good clarification.
I was published back when I was 13.
Long memory.
The first 3 books I wrote were aimed at middle grade audiences, and I thought, and middle grade audiences, it's kind of your protagonist is a save the world protagonist. You really want them to, it's what they aspire to. It's superhero sort of stuff, kind of thing, but usually bestowed. So something happens, and then they get these powers, and it's awesome.
Right.
And I struggled with each book in the trilogy increasing the stakes. So, well, they've already saved the universe in book 1. What are they going to do in book 2? And it only came to me the other day when I was listening to a particular lesson. I thought, okay. What I'd forgotten was that the stakes needed to be personal first.
Right.
And so, yes, okay, the plot stakes can keep going up, but you can only go so far sometimes.
Right.
And so you've got to kind of twist it or make something happen to the character that forces them into a new set of personal stakes, perhaps. And obviously then we're talking character arc, I guess, so you can come from character's point of view. And it just suddenly a whole layer of where stakes and consequences, personal versus agency. So I think, for me anyway, talking around, you can't separate stakes and agency.
Right.
And they sound like hang on, how can you talk about those in the same podcast? They're completely different things. One's to do with the plot, and the other one's to do with, who's in your story. But actually, you need both for the story to be cohesive, in my view.
No, that's exactly right. You do need both to be cohesive, and you can't have one without the other. You can have external stakes increasing, like, the village is going to be wiped out, the city is going to be wiped out, the world is going to be wiped out, right? But that's not interesting. What's interesting is how our characters interact with those stakes, and that's about agency, that's about choices. And you mentioned your own trilogy, Robert, and that you said, well, the universe has already been saved in book 1, and I thought of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, because they made that a running joke. If the world's going to end, beat me, I'll be dancing or whatever. And what kept the series going for 7 years is that we cared about the characters. And so, the Hellmouth was always going to open, the demons were always going to come out, the world was always going to end, but each time there was some new issue in the characters' relationships. Somebody important to the protagonist was in peril. So it wasn't ever just about saving the world. So as the conflict rises in terms of plot events, we also need the stakes to rise for the protagonist in terms of personal engagement. And that involves our other characters, our subplots, whatever that protagonist cares about. And that's what drives agency, because we make our choices based on what we care about, what we're invested in.
Yeah, it's also, that's you can create, I think anyway, that you can create drama and a sense of stakes from setting.
Mm-hmm.
Look at Frodo and Sam on, in
Mm-hmm.
Mordor. That's a dramatic setting. We've got to get this ring and chuck it down this volcano. But actually, at the end, what happens is a very intensely personal scene.
Mm-hmm.
And it's Frodo struggling to actually let go of it. And you could argue that actually he loses agency because Gollum does it. But it's interesting that it's okay to add the tension from the setting,
Mm-hmm.
but it's still got to come down to the stakes for the individual.
Right.
So otherwise it's just melodrama. It's and that's I've definitely suffered from that in the past. So, oh wow, this would be so cool. This giant rocket will land and these aliens will split.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that will be cool. Maybe for a page or two.
Right.
But after that, we want to see what happens with that.
Yeah.
What's the character going to do with that?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. That just reminded me of stories of alien invasions from War of the Worlds to Arrival. I mean, any of those kinds of stories, we have the immediate concern of external circumstances, of here comes the invading force, and oh no, what's going to happen to humanity? But that isn't an interesting question. The question only gets interesting when we care about one or a few specific individual human beings. And then the question becomes, how will Joe and Sarah survive this? How will, how will Mark communicate with the aliens? That's what engages us in story and creates the agency we're talking about. We have to track one specific protagonist through each development as that protagonist navigates a new set of choices with each new event.
So would you say then for every scene there should be something at stake?
For almost every scene, there should be something at stake. There are scenes where we're taking a downbeat. We're giving the characters in the world a rest. We're resolving some emotional movement from, so every chapter, there should be something at stake, whether it's big and external or small and internal. On the scale of scenes, it depends. There are other factors. But yeah, I'd say chapter. There should be something at stake. Mm-hmm.
When I remember reading, this is before I started writing, before I even thought I could actually possibly be a writer. Mm-hmm. But I was always fascinated by story, and especially running corporate training programs. I was interested in how corporate stories were delivered throughout corporations. I taught a lot of presentation skills. I taught people how to train others as well. So I trained trainers. And narrative is a big part, I think, of teaching people, because it puts things in perspective. It gives them what we call this referential index shift. They can place themselves in the story. Right. So if you can tell a story as opposed to deliver a dry presentation, it's always way more powerful. So I was reading a lot of things about story, and I picked up Robert McKee's book Story, which is technically very challenging. It's a big book. It's got lots of really nerdy stuff in it. Mm-hmm. And there was one thing that really stuck with me. Again, this was before I was even writing anything. But he drove this concept of a scene has to move the story forward. Now, I know that seems so incredibly basic to us probably on this podcast. You think, what do you? Oh, yeah, well, of course, you can't just have something boring. He came in, made a cup of tea, and then sat down and turned the TV on. There has to be something at stake or something moving it forward. But it was really funny because it caught me, and I suddenly started watching films, and I was saying to my wife Gabrielle, see, that did nothing to push that story forward. It's like, and as soon as you pick up on it, it's really interesting. Mm-hmm. Yeah, as writers, we can get a little bit lost in either the character or the setting or the plot, and kind of, this would be so cool if this happens. Or I'll have Kathy and Jim have a big argument in the cafe. Well, if it's that can sound dramatic. It can sound like there's something at stake, but is it at stake for the story? Does it move the story forward? Does the scene progress? So it's a real juggling act to not get lost in something that's just melodramatic as opposed to dramatically vital.
Yeah, yeah. And I like what you're saying about the argument in the cafe, because I think a easy approach to take that ends up being a mistake often is to go for big drama, high stakes, so to speak, and then it turns into melodrama if it's not truly organic to the story and to those characters. So Kathy and Jim could have a fight in the cafe where very little is said, but there could be great tension in long silences and big stakes for that relationship without any of the drama of raised voices or standing up or, tipping over the water glass or any of those kinds of dramatic gestures. So you can have a very quiet scene that moves the story forward dramatically.
Yes.
And that juxtaposition of quiet action with high stakes and tension can be hard to pull off, but one of the most compelling scenes to read.
Totally, because then we get a sense of character, and it could just be that one look or that one raised eyebrow or the few misspoken words that suddenly turn. That could be even your midpoint shift. I mean, it can be so subtle but it's turned the story. So yeah, I think this conversation that when we were discussing, stakes and agency, at first, as I said, at first glance, you think, they're different. No, they're different, but they can't. It's like the whole plot and character, isn't it? I suppose is really where if you zoom out, can you talk about plot without talking about character? Can you talk about character without talking about the story? I guess not.
Yeah. Yeah, no, you can't.
No, they're all intertwined.
They're like the strands of a braid woven together, plot, character, and setting.
But I suppose, in some way the agency, the stakes will depend, because they're intertwined, you've got to think a little bit about what type of story you're telling. And so, if you're writing a big Western, but the stakes are all about the characters' internal motivation, then that's going to be hard to pull off. It's going to be hard to commercialize as well because of the reader expectations, which is fine. That might be what you want to write, and don't have an issue with that. But it's worth stepping back a bit first and trying to understand. Okay, so this is what seems to be at stake in this story. So not just the rising stakes throughout, but the global consequences of the story, and then what type of character am I dropping into that, and what's at stake for them?
Right.
And so therefore, how am I going to run? What kind of agency do they have to affect that? And I don't think I've ever done that before. I don't think I've ever. You kind of get taken by a character and what you want them to do, and maybe that's okay for first draft. But I suppose in first revision, you might want to have a look at what have I really put in here in terms of stakes and agency. That'd be an interesting thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's critical. You need to.
Oh yeah. It's more than interesting.
I like what you just said, like kind of like listing it out just like that, so you can really visibly see. Here are my plot stakes. Here are my, here's what's at stake for the character, etc. So I have a question.
Good.
So your character's agency, right, is the choices that they're making that move them through the story. Does every choice have to be a win or a lose for whatever is at stake in that scene, or can it be like I know it can't be neutral, but does that whatever is at stake have to either win or lose, or is there any sort of middle ground for that? You know what I'm saying? Like, does every chapter, however we're saying that?
No, it's not really a win or lose situation. It's does this choice advance the plot? So think of it in terms of discovery. What is your character discovering? What is the reader discovering along with that character? How does it move us forward? So on my agency tree worksheet that I put into the character book, I use an example of a woman who discovers that her husband has taken out an insurance policy on her life and forged her signature. So that's a big discovery with high stakes, because now she's wondering, is he going to kill me? What's he doing with this insurance policy, right? So what is she going to do? Is she going to confront her husband? Is she going to play ignorant? Is she going to take out an insurance policy on his life? You know, maybe some combination of factors. And so where do I need to get to? Well, if she confronts him immediately, that might resolve that tension too soon. So I want to advance the story without going, you know, as we were saying in the Nicey Nice episode, short fuse, big explosion. I want to build this out. So where her husband is concerned, she's going to play ignorant, but the action she's going to take is to get out an insurance policy on him and fake his signature. And, you know, okay, so next situation, next plot point is he charters a sailboat and they're going to be out on the ocean, just the two of them for 3 weeks, you know, in the middle of the sea, cut off from land and support. So does she go on the sailboat? Does she bring a gun or a knife with her? Does she call her sister and say, if I don't come home, tell the cops he killed me? You know, what does she do? So each choice increases the dramatic tension, keeps us moving forward, waiting for that reveal, building into that moment that we're waiting for. So in those examples, it's not about win or lose. It's about pulling the reader deeper into the story.
Right.
And building on that plot point, increasing the stakes and the tension. It's escalation.
Right. Would you say that the stakes are changing every time that your character makes a choice, even just in like the minute? So like in that example, her first choice that she makes kind of changes the stakes from, oh no, is he going to kill me? There's your high stakes choice there, to a different kind of like, am I going to fight back? Or, you know, like what, how do the stakes change with every choice kind of a thing?
Yeah. And it's that escalation thing and keeping the game interesting, really gripping for the reader, because if she took the insurance policy to the police or to the insurance company, she might get her husband busted for insurance fraud, but that's not a very exciting story. But if she takes out an insurance policy on him, then we're thinking, oh, could this come to a life or death struggle? Could she be the winner? Could she be the one collecting the cash? And now both of them have questionable morals, and we see both of them might be fighters. She's not going to just abide the law or take this laying down. There's more at play with these two characters, you know, so we have to have our characters make the choices that escalate the plot, but also keep us intrigued in them as people.
And then you've got narrative devices like dramatic irony. So you might find that the reader knows more about the stakes than the character at some point. So there's always that. And I think what you were saying, Kathryn, as well, is about whether it's win or lose, and I would second what Alida said as well, is it's about moving the story forward appropriate to the genre. So whatever's at stake has to be at appropriate value. That's, you know, that isn't. Well, most of the time. I mean, occasionally it might be something that is a scene that illustrates something about the character that we need for later in the story. But, you know, it shouldn't be inconsequential. And I also think that when we get back to, it might not come in first draft, but when you come to revision and putting in subtleties and foreshadowing, there's always an unintended consequences of every action. So sometimes you can use those in certain stories because they can pop up later. So they might appear to win or lose or whatever the value at stake is in that particular scene, but then they could come back to bite them. So we might find it's not as neat. You know, I think what you were saying, Kathryn, is really nice. Is that sort of, you know, do we have to neatly tie it up in every scene? Well, At a surface level, yeah, it's got to run the story forward, but a story isn't just a surface level story, is it?
Right.
The good
Right.
ones, anyway.
Well,
So
maybe like what I'm thinking is more like when I think at stakes, I almost think of like gambling, right? Like a
Mhm.
yeah,
poker game,
yeah,
right? So you
Yeah.
have each hand has stakes that you have laid out, and then the game as a whole has your entire whatever you have, right? And I'm thinking like maybe in the insurance policy
Mhm.
situation, like there are multiple things that are at stake. One being maybe he's trying to kill her, but the other one could just be marital trust,
Uh-huh.
right? Is at stake, and so she's going to either win or lose the trust battle in that scene because she's either going to confront him and try and trust him and either win or lose that trust or not and win or lose that trust, right?
Mhm.
But her overall stakes are still going to be there because what is he going to do if she confronts him or if she doesn't is still higher level stakes still going
Right.
on. Does that make sense?
I think so.
I guess it's like everything else, right? We talk about layers upon layers upon layers,
yeah,
like
Yeah.
building up these little things.
Yeah. Well, and
So
the
I think
thing,
maybe it's just the wording that's throwing me off
yeah.
a little bit.
Well, I think the thing to add into the discussion is that with each new revelation the character has and each new choice, you want to play that out in the story. So once she discovers the insurance policy, dinner with her husband that night isn't going to be the same as it was the night before. There's going to be tension there, and there might be veiled comments. She might say something to see if he picks up on it, or she's watching his behavior. He pours her a glass of wine and she might smell it before she takes a drink, like, oh boy, what, so you want to play everything out, and there can be wins and losses, as you were saying, Kathryn, throughout these scenes as we build toward the big moment, toward the big pot on the table, with the hands, with the relationship crumbling, with her questioning herself, questioning her husband. Is she losing her mind? Who can she trust? Who's in on it? Anyone? So, in that sense, you're going to be playing the hands, to keep going with the poker metaphor. And some hands you fold, other hands I'm not a poker player, right? But
Yeah, me neither, but
yeah, so in that sense, yeah, just play it out, keep working it, building up to the big
right.
the big set of stakes. Mm-hmm.
Well, I suppose if you come to wrapping up the whole story, in my view anyway, a good story is a good story because the protagonist's agency is the thing that closes it.
Mm-hmm. Right. I agree. Those are wise words to end on. Thank you, Robert. Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.